relationship of MyBatis-Spring components in MyBatis. Here you can see the relationship of MyBatis-Spring components. Main components of here we are considering component structure of MyBatis. Main components of MyBatis-Spring are explained here. The main components of MyBatis-Spring are explained here. In MyBatis-Spring, MyBatis-3 and Spring are integrated by integrating following component. Here org.mybatis.spring.SQL session factory bin component that build the SQL session factory and stores object on Spring DI container. The standard MyBatis-3 SQL session factory is built based on the information defined in MyBatis configuration file. However, by using SQL session factory bin, SQL session factory can be built even in the absence of MyBatis configuration file. It can also be used in combination. org.mybatis.spring.mapper factory bin component that builds the singleton mapper object and stores object on Spring DI container. Mapper object generated by MyBatis-3 standard mechanism is not thread safe. Hence it was necessary to assign an instance for each thread. Mapper object created by MyBatis-Spring component can generate a thread safe mapper object. As a result, DI can be applied to singleton components like service, etc. org.mybatis.spring.SQL session template SQL session component of singleton version that implements SQL session interface. SQL session object generated by MyBatis-3 standard mechanism is not thread safe. Hence, it was necessary to assign an instance for each thread. SQL session object generated by MyBatis-Spring component can generate a thread safe SQL session object. As a result, DI can be applied to singleton components like service, etc. However, this guideline does not assume handling SQL session directly. And the flow by which the main components MyBatis-Spring access the database is explained here. Processes that access database can be broadly divided into two types. Processes that are performed at the start of the application. Processes 1 to 4 mentioned here correspond to this type. Processes that are performed for each request per client. Processes 5 to 11 mentioned here correspond to this type. Processes that are performed at the start of the application are executed by the following flow. One, SQL session factory bean request building SQL session factory for SQL session factory builder. 2. SQL session factory builder reads MyBatis configuration file for generating SQL session factory. 3. SQL session factory builder generates SQL session factory based on the definition of the MyBatis configuration file. SQL session factory thus generated is stored by the Spring DI container. 4. Mapper factory bean generates a thread safe SQL session template and a thread safe mapper object proxy object of mapper interface here. Mapper object thus generated is stored in the Spring DI container, and DI is applied for service class, etc. Mapper object provides a thread safe implementation by using thread safe SQL session template. Processes that are performed for each request from the client are executed by the following flow. 5. Client request a process for the application. 6. Application service calls the method of mapper object proxy object that implements mapper interface injected by DI container. 7. Mapper object calls SQL session template method corresponding to the called method. 8. SQL session template calls the proxy enabled and thread safe session method. 9. Proxy enabled and thread safe session uses MyBatis-3 standard SQL session assigned to the transaction. When SQL session assigned to the transaction does not exist, SQL session factory method is called to fetch SQL session of the standard MyBatis-3. 10. SQL session factory returns MyBatis-3 standard SQL session. Since the returned MyBatis-3 standard SQL session is assigned to the transaction, if it is within the same transaction, same SQL session is used without creating new one. 11. MyBatis standard SQL session fetches SQL to be executed from the mapping file and execute the SQL. Transaction control, although it is not explained in the flow, the commit and rollback of transaction is performed by string transaction control function. Here you can see SQL session bean factory SQL session factory builder, MyBatis config file, and mapper interfaces are basically with processing to run once here. SQL session factory bean is SQL session factory bean is connected to SQL session factory builder. SQL session factory builder is connected to MyBatis config file. SQL session factory builder is connected to session factory, and 4. Mapper factory bean is connected to SQL session templates. Here mapper interface, application service, JDK proxy and mapping files are basically inside processing to run per request. SQL session is inside JDK proxy. Here 5 client is connected to application service. 6 application service is connected to mapper interface. 7 mapper interface is connected to SQL session template. 8 SQL session template is connected to JDK proxy. SQL session is inside JDK proxy, and 9 JDK proxy is connected to SQL session factory. 10 SQL session factory is connected to SQL session. 11 SQL session is connected to mapping file. And here SQL session factory bean, mapper factory bean, and SQL session template are provided by MyBatis-Spring. SQL session factory builder, MyBatis config file, session factory, and SQL session are provided by MyBatis-Spring. Mapper interface and mapper file are provided by file implements by developer. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.